Hello, and welcome to the Fluent English Journey. Today's lesson focuses on C1 Advanced English Vocabulary, with special attention to more than 40 high-level words related to global issues. This lesson is not only about learning new words or memorizing a list. Instead, the goal is much deeper and more practical. Our main purpose is to help you become confident in serious, informed conversations. At a C1 level, English is not just about understanding meanings. It is about expressing ideas clearly, accurately, and with depth. We want to help you move beyond basic explanations and learn how to talk about complex topics such as climate change, inequality, conflict, and global crises in a thoughtful and nuanced way. These are the kinds of skills you need for critical thinking, academic writing, and high-level discussions or debates. That is exactly the value of today's lesson. When you reach C1 proficiency, vocabulary stops being just descriptive. It becomes a tool for analysis. The words and expressions we are covering today help you break down problems, explain causes and effects, compare ideas, and evaluate solutions. Whether you are writing an advanced essay about environmental problems or taking part in an important discussion about social injustice, this vocabulary will significantly improve your ability to understand and explain global issues. In fact, having the right vocabulary also helps you think more clearly. Language shapes thought. When you have precise words, you can organize your ideas better and understand complex situations more deeply. Because global issues are such a large and complicated topic, we have organized this lesson into 4 connected sections. This structure will help make the information clearer and easier to remember. First, we will focus on the planet. This section looks at environmental damage and, just as importantly, possible solutions. Second, we will move to people, examining social and economic inequality and human well-being. Third, we will explore systems, including conflict, security, governance, and political structures. Finally, we will look at global economic dynamics, using vocabulary related to international trade, finance, and economic power. This structure is important because global crises do not exist separately. Everything is connected. Environmental damage affects people. Economic systems influence conflict. Political decisions impact climate and inequality. The world operates like a web, where one problem influences many others. Now, let's begin with Part 1, the planetary crisis, starting with environmental issues. At a C1 level, precision in language is essential. Many environmental terms are often used incorrectly or interchangeably, but advanced speakers must understand the differences clearly. For example, we need to distinguish between climate change and global warming. Climate change refers to long-term, large-scale changes in temperature, weather patterns, and climate systems across the planet. It describes changes over decades or even centuries. These changes are mainly caused by anthropogenic activities, meaning actions carried out by humans. The biggest contributors are the continued burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. Scientific evidence clearly shows that climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of natural disasters around the world. A key C1 word here is exacerbates, which means makes something worse. Climate change does not just cause problems, it intensifies them. Storms become stronger, droughts last longer, and heat waves become more dangerous. Events that were once manageable now turn into disasters. So how is global warming different? Global warming is a specific process that contributes to climate change. It refers to the steady increase in the Earth's average surface temperature. This warming happens because of high levels of greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide. These gases come mainly from industrial pollution, energy production, and deforestation. Scientists around the world strongly agree that global warming is real and that human activity is the primary cause. This brings us to the greenhouse effect, which explains how warming happens. The greenhouse effect occurs when gases in the atmosphere trap heat from the sun instead of letting it escape back into space. Carbon dioxide is the most well-known greenhouse gas, but others also play a role. It is important to understand a key distinction here. The greenhouse effect itself is natural and necessary. Without it, Earth would be too cold to support life. You can think of it like a blanket that keeps the planet warm. The problem arises with the enhanced greenhouse effect. Human pollution makes this blanket too thick. As a result, too much heat is trapped, and the planet becomes dangerously warm. Because of this, many environmental policies focus on reducing emissions and promoting decarbonization, which means reducing dependence on fossil fuels and switching to cleaner energy sources. Next, we need to look at the direct damage humans are causing to nature, especially through deforestation. Deforestation refers to the large-scale and permanent removal of forests. This often happens because of agricultural expansion, urban development, or illegal logging. Forests are cleared to make space for crops, cattle, roads, or buildings. The consequences go far beyond the loss of trees. Deforestation causes severe environmental degradation, meaning the natural environment becomes weaker and less able to support life. The effects are not the same everywhere. In regions like the Amazon rainforest, deforestation leads to catastrophic biodiversity loss, which means plants and animals disappear permanently. It also threatens indigenous communities whose cultures, food systems, and survival depend on healthy forest ecosystems. Illegal logging worsens the problem by undermining conservation efforts and increasing global carbon emissions. Overall, deforestation is a serious global issue that requires strong international cooperation and long-term commitment to solve. Yes, it truly does. The scale and complexity of these environmental problems mean that serious international cooperation is absolutely necessary. No single country can protect vital ecosystems like rainforests or oceans on its own. These natural systems cross borders, and protecting them requires countries to work together, share resources, and commit to long-term solutions. Now, you mentioned biodiversity loss, which is a term that appears constantly in environmental discussions, so it is important to define it clearly. Biodiversity loss refers to the rapid and ongoing decline in the variety of life on Earth. This includes plants, animals, insects, and microorganisms. It can happen within a single ecosystem, across an entire biome, or even at the global level. The main cause of biodiversity loss is habitat destruction, especially deforestation. However, other major contributors include pollution, invasive species, and climate change itself. This loss of biodiversity is extremely dangerous because it weakens the stability and resilience of ecosystems. When ecosystems lose diversity, they become less able to adapt to change, recover from disasters, or support life. In other words, biodiversity loss is a systemic risk. It does not just affect individual species, it damages the entire web of life. Biodiversity loss is also directly connected to climate change, and its effects are not limited to land environments. The oceans are also under serious threat. Rising ocean temperatures and ocean acidification are causing rapid biodiversity loss in marine ecosystems. Coral reefs, which support huge numbers of marine species, are now facing severe danger. In some cases, entire reef systems are dying. This means extinction for many species and serious consequences for coastal communities that depend on the ocean for food and income. To slow or reverse biodiversity loss, strong action is needed. One important strategy is investing in protected areas, often called conservation parks or nature reserves. These areas are designed to protect ecosystems and preserve genetic diversity, giving species a chance to survive and recover. At times, it truly feels like a race against time. And in many ways, it is. Next, let's move on to another key term, pollution. At first, this word may seem simple, but at a C1 level, we need a precise definition. Pollution is the introduction of harmful or toxic substances into the environment, including the air, water, and soil. These substances often enter the environment in quantities that exceed nature's ability to absorb, dilute, or neutralize them safely. Pollution is not just an environmental issue, it is also a serious human health crisis. For example, in rapidly industrializing cities such as Beijing or Delhi, severe air pollution has been directly linked to high rates of respiratory illnesses. People suffer from asthma, chronic lung diseases, and other serious health conditions. Children and the elderly are especially vulnerable. Air pollution reduces quality of life and shortens life expectancy. Water pollution is just as dangerous. When industrial waste is released into rivers without proper regulation, it contaminates entire water systems. This does not only kill fish and aquatic life, it also destroys drinking water sources for communities living downstream. The result is illness, economic hardship, and long-term environmental damage. Because of this, effective responses to pollution must go beyond simple punishments like fines. Fines alone do not clean rivers or fix air quality. Governments need strong regulatory frameworks that target the source of pollution. This includes strict controls on vehicle emissions, limits on industrial waste, and enforcement of environmental laws. Now, let's turn to some specific environmental threats related to the atmosphere and water systems. The first is ozone depletion. This was a major global concern several decades ago, and it remains an important case study. Ozone depletion refers to the gradual thinning of the ozone layer, which is located high in the Earth's atmosphere. This layer protects life on Earth by blocking most of the sun's harmful ultraviolet (UV) radiation. The thinning of the ozone layer was caused mainly by human-made chemicals known as chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. These chemicals were once widely used in aerosol sprays, refrigerators, and air conditioning systems. The consequences of ozone depletion were serious. Increased UV radiation reached the Earth's surface, leading to higher rates of skin cancer, eye damage such as cataracts, and weakened immune systems in humans. However, this is one of the few environmental issues with a genuinely hopeful outcome. In the late 1980s, countries around the world signed the Montreal Protocol, an international agreement to phase out the use of CFCs. Because of this coordinated global action, the ozone layer is now slowly recovering. This shows that when countries work together, it is possible to reverse even major environmental threats. That is an encouraging lesson, and one we desperately need today. Next, we have acid rain. Acid rain refers to rain or other forms of precipitation that become unusually acidic due to air pollution. It is mainly caused by sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides released from power plants, factories, and vehicles that burn fossil fuels. These gases mix with water and oxygen in the atmosphere, forming sulfuric and nitric acids. Acid rain causes widespread environmental damage. It acidifies soil, weakens forests, and pollutes lakes and rivers, often killing fish and other aquatic organisms. Regions in Europe and North America experience severe effects during periods of heavy industrial pollution. But acid rain also causes damage that people often overlook. It slowly erodes historic stone buildings, statues, and monuments. Over time, it can destroy important cultural heritage, literally dissolving parts of human history. This shows how pollution does not just harm nature, but also affects culture, history, and identity. All of these issues are deeply interconnected. Environmental damage spreads through natural systems, human systems, and even cultural systems. Finally, within this group of environmental threats, we must address one of the most urgent challenges of all: water scarcity. Yes, exactly. Water scarcity essentially means a lack of water. More precisely, water scarcity is defined as the insufficient availability of clean, reliable freshwater to meet the needs of a population and the ecosystems that support it. This includes water for drinking, sanitation, agriculture, industry, and natural environments. This problem is becoming more severe because of climate change. Rising temperatures and shifting weather patterns are causing persistent droughts, especially in arid and semi-arid regions. Areas such as the Sahel in Africa, parts of the Middle East, Australia, and the American Southwest are already experiencing extreme pressure on their water resources. At AC1 level, one of the most important insights is understanding the connection between water scarcity and food systems. Water scarcity directly limits agricultural production. Without sufficient water, crops cannot grow and livestock cannot survive. This threatens food security, meaning the ability of people to reliably access enough nutritious food. Once again, we see how deeply interconnected these global problems are. Water, climate, and food systems are all closely linked, and stress in one area quickly spreads to others. This interconnectedness makes it clear that we are not facing isolated problems. Instead, we are dealing with a system of global challenges that influence and reinforce one another. This naturally leads us to the language of solutions. We have identified the problems. Now we must ask how to talk about solving them. The central question becomes, how can societies grow, develop, and improve living standards without destroying the planet or harming future generations? The framework most often used to answer this question is sustainable development. Sustainable development refers to economic and technological progress that meets current human needs, such as food, energy, housing, and employment, without reducing the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It is based on balancing three essential pillars: economic viability, social equity, and environmental protection. In practice, sustainable development is now at the heart of major international efforts, including the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These goals influence real policies around the world. They affect how cities are designed, encouraging public transport, green spaces, and low-emission infrastructure. They also push governments and corporations to rethink how goods are produced, transported, and consumed. Corporate responsibility is a major part of this shift. Businesses are increasingly expected to integrate sustainable practices across their entire supply chains, from raw materials to final products. While progress can be slow, sustainability is steadily becoming part of the mainstream. Energy plays a crucial role in this transition. One of the most important components of sustainable development is the global move toward renewable energy. Renewable energy comes from sources that naturally replenish themselves, such as solar power, wind energy, geothermal heat, hydropower, and some forms of biomass. Governments around the world are encouraging this shift by offering financial incentives, subsidies, and setting national targets. The goal is to reduce the world's heavy and dangerous dependence on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are finite, non-renewable energy sources formed from the remains of ancient plants and animals over millions of years. The main types are coal, oil, and natural gas. At present, these fuels still provide most of the world's electricity and transportation energy. This creates a major challenge. Fossil fuels remain essential to modern economies, yet they are also the primary drivers of climate change and environmental destruction. Extracting and burning them causes oil spills, habitat loss, air pollution, and rising greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, societies face a race against time to phase out fossil fuels while still maintaining economic stability. This is where the concept of mitigation becomes important. Mitigation means reducing the severity of harm. In environmental terms, it refers to actions taken to limit climate change and environmental damage, even if these problems cannot be eliminated immediately. Finally, on the environmental side, we must consider individual and corporate responsibility, which is often discussed through the concept of the carbon footprint. A carbon footprint is a measurement of the total amount of greenhouse gases produced directly and indirectly by an individual, organization, product, or event. It is usually expressed in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. Calculating a carbon footprint helps people understand how their everyday choices, such as driving, flying, or diet, contribute to climate change. For companies, carbon footprint calculations often guide sustainability strategies. Many organizations aim to reduce emissions and sometimes invest in carbon offset projects, such as reforestation or renewable energy development, as part of their environmental and social responsibility commitments. This concludes our exploration of the vocabulary of the planetary crisis. We have examined the main environmental problems, specific threats, and the language used to describe solutions. These C1 terms allow learners to clearly and confidently discuss environmental risks and responses. Now that we have explored the degradation of the planet, it is time to turn our attention inward to the human dimension of global challenges. Our focus shifts to the structural, socioeconomic issues affecting people worldwide. These issues are deeply connected to environmental problems and must be understood together. We begin with two of the most fundamental concepts, poverty and inequality. Let's start with poverty. At a C1 level, poverty is more than simply being poor. It involves deeper questions of access, opportunity, and structural disadvantage. At its most basic level, poverty is the condition of not having enough money or material resources to meet essential human needs. These needs include adequate food, clean drinking water, safe and stable housing, basic health care, and access to education. Poverty is not only about income. It is also about a lack of opportunity, capability, and choice. People living in poverty often have very limited control over their lives and very few paths to improve their situation. The scale of global poverty is overwhelming. Extreme poverty, often defined as living on less than about $2.15 per day, still affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. While definitions may vary, the reality remains severe. Extreme poverty is especially concentrated in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, where historical, economic, and political factors combine to limit development. When we look at solutions, immediate assistance is clearly necessary. Government support programs, food aid, and direct cash transfers can help reduce suffering and save lives, particularly in areas affected by urban poverty or humanitarian crises. However, research and long-term development experience consistently show that the most effective and lasting solution to poverty is education. Education plays a central role in breaking the cycle of generational poverty, where poverty is passed from parents to children. By providing skills, knowledge, and confidence, education opens doors to better jobs, improved health outcomes, higher income, and greater social mobility. In this sense, poverty is not simply about a lack of money. It is about a lack of opportunity. Education is one of the most powerful tools for changing that reality. Closely connected to poverty is the issue of inequality. The two problems often exist together and reinforce one another. Inequality refers to the unfair and avoidable distribution of resources, opportunities, and rights among individuals or groups within a society, or even between countries at the global level. It is not just about difference, it is about injustice. One of the most visible forms of inequality is income inequality, where wealth becomes increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of people struggle to keep up. This creates a widening gap between the very rich and everyone else, weakening social cohesion and trust. However, inequality extends far beyond money. Gender inequality, for example, continues to exist in nearly every part of the world. Women often face structural barriers in the workplace, such as unequal pay, limited access to leadership roles, and underrepresentation in politics. The idea of the glass ceiling is commonly used to describe these invisible barriers that prevent women from reaching the highest levels of power and influence. To reduce inequality, policies must address these systemic barriers and underlying power imbalances. The goal is not just equal outcomes, but distributive justice, where resources and opportunities are shared fairly so that everyone has a genuine chance to succeed. Next, we turn to pressures related to population and resources, beginning with the often controversial concept of overpopulation. Overpopulation is not simply about having too many people. It refers to a situation where the number of people in a particular area exceeds the carrying capacity of that environment. In other words, there are more people than the available resources can sustainably support at a given level of technology and consumption. This distinction is important. Overpopulation depends on how resources are used, how much people consume, and how efficiently systems are managed. A large population does not automatically create problems, but when population growth outpaces infrastructure and resource availability, serious challenges arise. Overpopulation places enormous pressure on housing, transportation, sanitation systems, healthcare, and natural resources. In dry or semi-arid regions, it can lead to the rapid depletion of groundwater, worsening water scarcity. In fast-growing cities, especially in developing countries, it often results in severe housing shortages. This can lead to the expansion of informal settlements or slums, where people live in overcrowded and unsafe conditions. Addressing overpopulation requires a balanced and ethical approach. Solutions include promoting sustainable consumption, investing in better resource management, improving urban planning, and supporting voluntary family planning and public health education. These measures focus on empowerment and informed choice rather than coercion. Now, let's examine two closely related terms that deal directly with basic human needs and health: food insecurity and malnutrition. We'll start with food insecurity. Food insecurity refers to a condition in which people do not have consistent, reliable access to enough safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and live healthy, active lives. It is not just about occasional hunger. It is about uncertainty, instability, and lack of access over time. Food insecurity becomes especially severe in conflict zones, where violence disrupts agriculture, transportation, and supply chains. It is also closely linked to climate change. Droughts, floods, and unpredictable growing seasons make farming more difficult and less reliable. As a result, climate change increases the risk of famine and worsens food insecurity around the world. Once again, we see how global challenges are deeply interconnected. Poverty, inequality, population pressure, climate change, and food systems all influence one another, forming a complex web of cause and effect. So, how does malnutrition differ from food insecurity? Malnutrition is the physical condition that results from an insufficient, unbalanced, or poor quality diet. It includes both undernutrition and, in some contexts, obesity. However, when discussing global crises, the focus is usually on undernutrition, which has especially severe consequences for children. Undernutrition can lead to serious health problems. Two critical conditions are stunting and wasting. Stunting refers to impaired growth and development caused by long-term lack of adequate nutrition. Wasting describes a condition where children become dangerously thin due to acute food shortages or illness. Both conditions can have lifelong effects, damaging physical health, weakening immune systems, and limiting cognitive development and learning ability. Addressing malnutrition requires more than simply providing enough calories. Effective solutions must ensure nutritional quality. This often involves distributing fortified foods, which are enriched with essential vitamins and minerals, such as vitamin A, iron, and iodine. These targeted interventions are necessary to support healthy growth and long-term development. Now, returning briefly to specific forms of social injustice, we have already touched on gender inequality, but it is important to examine how systemic bias limits women's and girls' access to education. In many parts of the world, girls are still less likely than boys to enroll in or complete primary and especially secondary education. This is often due to cultural traditions, safety concerns, early marriage, or the expectation that girls perform unpaid domestic labor. As a result, girls miss out on education that could transform their futures. The lack of access to education severely restricts women's economic opportunities, worsens health outcomes, and reduces their ability to advocate for their own rights. Over time, this perpetuates cycles of poverty and social disempowerment. Addressing this issue requires targeted policy interventions. These include scholarships specifically for girls, making schools safer and more accessible, challenging discriminatory social norms, and offering financial incentives to families who keep their daughters in school. Beyond education, workplace equality policies such as gender quotas, equal pay laws, and affordable childcare are also essential for dismantling patriarchal structures and promoting genuine gender equality. Another deeply troubling issue linked to inequality and poverty is child labor. Child labor refers to the systematic exploitation of children through work that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally harmful, or that interferes with their compulsory education. It robs children of their childhood, limits their potential, and violates their dignity and basic rights. Despite international agreements and conventions, child labor continues to exist, especially in agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and domestic work. It is often hidden within informal and poorly regulated sectors of the economy, making it difficult to detect and eliminate. Simply banning child labor is not enough, although strong laws and strict enforcement are essential. True eradication requires deeper structural solutions. These include making education accessible, affordable, and relevant, as well as building strong social safety nets and creating sustainable economic opportunities for families. When families are not forced by poverty to rely on child labor, children can stay in school where they belong. Finally, in this section on people and society, we must address the foundation of human dignity, human rights. Human rights are the basic freedoms and entitlements that belong to all people, regardless of race, gender, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. These rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of expression and belief, and the rights to work, healthcare, and education. They are formally recognized in international agreements, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When human rights are violated, the consequences often extend beyond national borders. Persistent and well-documented abuses can lead to international condemnation, diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and global advocacy efforts. Organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch play a vital role in monitoring violations, documenting abuses, and pushing for accountability, particularly in conflict zones or under authoritarian governments. Education about human rights is crucial for building tolerant, inclusive, and accountable societies. People must understand their rights in order to defend and claim them. This vulnerability, the violation of human rights, leads us to the final term in this section, the refugee crisis. A refugee crisis occurs when large numbers of people are forced to flee their homes and cross international borders, usually because of war, widespread violence, persecution, or major natural disasters. Refugees often flee due to threats based on race, religion, nationality, political beliefs, or membership in a particular social group. Such crises place enormous pressure on neighboring countries that receive refugees, creating economic, social, and logistical challenges. They can also lead to broader geopolitical tensions. A clear contemporary example is the Syrian refugee crisis, which began around 2011. Millions of people were displaced, putting immense strain on countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and several European nations. In the short term, humanitarian organizations and agencies like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees provide emergency assistance, including food, shelter, healthcare, and temporary housing. However, the long-term solution requires durable international responses. These include refugee resettlement, social integration in host countries, and most importantly, resolving the conflicts or persecution that caused people to flee. Only then can refugees safely return home and rebuild their lives. It is truly a complex and heartbreaking issue. Now we move to part 3, where the focus shifts to political systems, global security, and geopolitical stability. This area examines the structures that are meant to maintain order in the world, but which can also, when they fail or are abused, create enormous instability, conflict, and human suffering. We begin with crimes that cross national borders and exploit human vulnerability. One of the most severe and disturbing examples is human trafficking. Human trafficking is the illegal trade of human beings, usually carried out by organized and highly sophisticated transnational criminal networks. The goal of trafficking is exploitation, which can take many forms, including forced labor, sexual exploitation, forced marriage, and even organ trafficking. In essence, human trafficking represents a modern form of slavery. Combating human trafficking is extremely challenging. It requires strong international cooperation, including intelligence sharing between governments, coordinated law enforcement operations, and effective legal frameworks to investigate and prosecute traffickers across borders. However, enforcement alone is not enough. Equally important is providing comprehensive support for survivors after they are rescued. This includes psychological counseling, medical care, safe housing, education, job training, and long-term assistance to help survivors reintegrate into society. Unfortunately, these support systems are often underfunded and overstretched, revealing one of the darkest sides of globalization. Next, we turn to another major threat to governance and development: corruption. Corruption is generally defined as dishonest, illegal, or unethical behavior by individuals in positions of power or authority. It includes practices such as bribery, embezzlement of public funds, nepotism, cronyism, and the misuse of public resources for personal gain. The impact of corruption goes far beyond financial loss. It is a systemic obstacle to development and democracy. Widespread corruption undermines public trust in institutions, weakens the rule of law, distorts markets, and slows economic growth. In extreme cases, corruption scandals can destabilize or even collapse governments. The poorest and most vulnerable members of society are often the ones who suffer the most from corrupt systems. Preventing corruption requires structural solutions. These include radical transparency in government decision-making, especially in public procurement and state contracts, as well as the creation of truly independent anti-corruption agencies with the authority and resources to investigate and prosecute wrongdoing at the highest levels. Now, let's examine political systems themselves. Two systems are often contrasted: democracy and authoritarianism. Democracy is a system of governance based on popular sovereignty, meaning that political power ultimately belongs to the people. This power is exercised either directly or, more commonly, through elected representatives chosen in free, fair, and competitive elections. Core democratic principles include the rule of law, protection of human rights, political pluralism, and accountability of leaders. However, even well-established democracies face serious challenges. These include disinformation campaigns, electoral manipulation, foreign interference, gerrymandering, and voter suppression. Such practices weaken democratic institutions and undermine the principle of fair representation. Strengthening democracy is therefore an ongoing process. It requires investment in civic education, protection of independent media, promotion of media literacy, and constant efforts to safeguard electoral integrity. In contrast, authoritarianism is characterized by the concentration of power in the hands of a single leader or a small ruling group. Political pluralism is severely restricted, and civil liberties are often suppressed. Authoritarian regimes maintain control through censorship, state surveillance, manipulation of the legal system, restrictions on free speech and assembly, and the intimidation or imprisonment of political opponents. Although authoritarian systems may appear stable on the surface, history shows that transitions away from authoritarian rule are often turbulent and unpredictable. This is because trust in institutions, democratic norms, and social cohesion have frequently been weakened or destroyed over time. Rebuilding these foundations can take generations and is often accompanied by political unrest or even violent conflict. Finally, we turn to the architecture of social hatred, which underpins many forms of violence and persecution. The first key term here is xenophobia. Xenophobia is defined as an intense or irrational fear, dislike, or hatred of people perceived as foreign or different, often based on nationality, ethnicity, culture, or religion. Xenophobia tends to increase during periods of economic uncertainty, large-scale migration, or political instability, when fear and misinformation are easily exploited. This kind of prejudice often increases sharply during periods of large-scale international migration, economic insecurity, or intense political debates about national identity and immigration. In many cases, fear of outsiders is deliberately manipulated for political gain. Xenophobia actively undermines multicultural integration, fuels discrimination, and deepens social divisions within societies. The most effective ways to counter xenophobia include promoting intercultural understanding through strong education programs, enforcing anti-discrimination laws, and implementing inclusive policies that challenge hateful rhetoric and protect minority communities. Closely related, but clearly distinct, is racism. Racism refers to prejudice, discrimination, or hostility directed at individuals or groups based on race, often rooted in the belief that one race is superior to others. Racism can exist at an individual level, but its most damaging form is systemic or institutional racism. This occurs when laws, policies, and social structures consistently disadvantage certain racial groups. Systemic racism is visible in unequal access to housing, employment opportunities, quality education, healthcare, and fair treatment within the criminal justice system. These disparities are not accidental; they are the result of long-standing structural inequalities. In response, anti-racism movements around the world advocate for institutional reform. These movements support measures such as policy changes to dismantle discriminatory systems, affirmative action programs, and approaches like restorative justice. Their goal is not only awareness, but meaningful structural change that removes deep-rooted barriers to racial equality. The most extreme and horrific outcome of entrenched prejudice is genocide. Under international law, specifically the Genocide Convention, genocide is defined as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. This includes killing members of the group, causing serious harm, or deliberately creating conditions designed to lead to their destruction. The explicit aim of genocide is the eradication of a people. Tragic examples include the Holocaust, the genocide in Rwanda, and mass atrocities in Cambodia. These events represent some of the darkest chapters in human history. Accountability for genocide is essential. International institutions such as the International Criminal Court and special tribunals have been established to prosecute those responsible for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. However, prosecution alone is not enough. The global priority must be prevention. This requires early warning systems, effective diplomacy, intelligence sharing, and, most importantly, the political will to intervene before mass violence begins. The phrase, "never again," must be a commitment, not just a slogan. Now let us turn to modern security threats, beginning with terrorism. Terrorism is broadly defined as the unlawful use of violence or intimidation, usually against civilians, to achieve political, ideological, or religious goals. The primary aim is to spread fear, pressure governments, or destabilize societies. The response to terrorism typically involves specialized counterterrorism units and intelligence agencies working together to detect threats, disrupt networks, and prevent attacks. This often requires international cooperation and information sharing. However, terrorism also raises difficult questions about how to balance national security with civil liberties and human rights. Terrorism contributes significantly to global instability and often fuels prolonged conflicts. Addressing it requires not only security measures, but also long-term efforts to address root causes such as political grievances, social exclusion, and radicalization. Next, we move into the digital domain with cybersecurity. Cybersecurity refers to the technologies, policies, and practices designed to protect computer systems, networks, and data from unauthorized access, attacks, theft, or damage. In today's highly connected world, cybersecurity has become a critical priority for governments, businesses, and institutions. Organizations invest billions of dollars each year to protect sensitive information, critical infrastructure, and personal data from hackers, criminal networks, and state-sponsored actors. Cyber threats are constantly evolving, making this a rapidly expanding professional field. When cybersecurity fails, the consequences can be severe. Data breaches can cause massive financial losses, damage reputations, expose personal information, and lead to identity theft and fraud. In extreme cases, cyber attacks can disrupt essential services such as energy, healthcare, or transportation, and even create international tensions if state actors are involved. Finally, we turn to global health security and the important distinction between epidemics and pandemics. An epidemic is a sudden and rapid outbreak of an infectious disease that affects a large number of people within a specific community, region, or population. Epidemics are geographically limited. For example, a severe outbreak of cholera overwhelming hospitals in a single city after a natural disaster would be considered an epidemic. A pandemic is defined mainly by its geographical scale. While an epidemic is limited to a specific area, A pandemic is an outbreak of disease that spreads across multiple countries or even continents and affects large numbers of people worldwide. Unfortunately, we all have very recent experience with this through the COVID-19 pandemic, which dramatically changed daily life across the globe. It disrupted international travel, global trade, education systems, healthcare services, and public policy for several years. Its impact was truly global and long-lasting. Responding to epidemics and pandemics requires fast, coordinated, and well-organized public health responses. One of the most important tools in controlling infectious diseases is vaccination. Vaccination involves administering a vaccine that contains a weakened or inactive form of a virus or bacterium, or part of its genetic material. This stimulates the body's immune system to recognize the disease and build protection against it. Large-scale vaccination campaigns aim to achieve herd immunity, where enough people are immune that the disease can no longer spread easily. Historic global efforts, such as vaccination campaigns against smallpox and polio, show how powerful this strategy can be in protecting entire populations. However, vaccination efforts face significant challenges, especially vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy refers to reluctance or refusal to receive vaccines despite their availability. This can be caused by misinformation, distrust of governments or scientific institutions, fear of side effects, or religious and philosophical beliefs. When vaccination rates fall too low, outbreaks last longer, diseases continue circulating, and vulnerable populations such as the elderly or immunocompromised face greater risks. Addressing vaccine hesitancy requires transparency, clear communication, community engagement, and respectful responses to people's concerns. Now, we turn to the vocabulary of war and international security, beginning with war crimes. War crimes are serious violations of international humanitarian law, particularly the rules set out in the Geneva Conventions. These crimes occur during armed conflict and include acts such as deliberately killing or torturing civilians or prisoners of war, targeting hospitals or civilian infrastructure, taking hostages, using prohibited weapons, and destroying property without military necessity. Justice for war crimes is pursued through international legal mechanisms, most notably the International Criminal Court and special international tribunals. These courts seek to hold individuals accountable regardless of their rank or position. A critical part of this process is the documentation of evidence by journalists, human rights organizations, and international investigators. Their work helps ensure that violations of the laws of war are recorded and prosecuted, and that perpetrators cannot act with impunity. On a broader strategic level, we must address nuclear proliferation. Nuclear proliferation refers to the spread of nuclear weapons, nuclear materials such as enriched uranium or plutonium, and the technology required to deliver them, such as ballistic missiles, to states or non-state actors that do not already possess them. Proliferation is usually discussed in two forms. Horizontal proliferation occurs when more countries acquire nuclear weapons. Vertical proliferation occurs when existing nuclear powers expand or modernize their arsenals. Efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation rely heavily on international agreements, most importantly, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. The NPT aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, encourage disarmament by nuclear-armed states, and allow the peaceful use of nuclear energy under strict safeguards. Compliance with these agreements is monitored through inspections conducted by international organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. Failure to control nuclear proliferation significantly increases global security risks. It raises the possibility of regional conflicts escalating into nuclear confrontations and poses a threat to international stability and human survival. Finally, we come to the concept of the arms race. An arms race is a competitive and often dangerous process in which two or more countries seek military superiority by rapidly developing, producing, and stockpiling weapons. One of the most famous examples is the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This rivalry led to massive arsenals of nuclear weapons and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, meaning that any nuclear conflict would result in catastrophic losses for all sides. Arms races did not end with the Cold War. Today, regional arms races continue to exist, driven by geopolitical tensions, security fears, and rivalries between neighboring states. These competitions divert enormous resources away from social development, increase mistrust, and raise the risk of armed conflict. The most realistic path toward reducing these dangers involves sustained diplomatic dialogue, confidence-building measures, transparency, and verifiable arms control agreements. De-escalation strategies and cooperation are essential to lower the level of armaments and reduce the likelihood of conflict in an increasingly interconnected and fragile world. This brings us to the end of our intensive exploration of vocabulary related to political instability, security threats, and systemic violence. These topics are difficult and often unsettling, but they are essential for understanding the modern world. We now conclude by turning our attention to the language of international commerce and economic stability, because global economic systems form the foundation beneath almost all the social, political, and environmental issues discussed so far. The global economy strongly influences how resources are used, how wealth is distributed, and how conflicts emerge or are sustained. Inequality, migration, political unrest, and even war often have deep economic causes. For this reason, our final set of C1 terms focuses on how countries interact economically and how they manage their trade relationships, either by encouraging openness or enforcing protection. We begin with one of the most important and widely debated concepts in modern economics: globalization. Globalization is a broad and complex process, and it can mean different things depending on perspective. In general terms, it refers to the increasing interconnectedness of countries through trade, investment, technology, migration, culture, and information exchange. Businesses operate across borders, supply chains stretch across continents, and ideas, products, and services move faster than ever before. As a result, national economies have become deeply interdependent. Globalization brings clear benefits. It facilitates international trade, encourages innovation, improves access to goods and services, and can lower consumer prices through competition. However, it also has significant downsides. Evidence consistently shows that globalization can increase economic inequality both within countries and between them. Skilled workers and developed economies often benefit more than unskilled workers and developing nations. These imbalances frequently generate social tension, political dissatisfaction, and resistance among populations who feel left behind. One way this resistance manifests is through protectionism. Protectionism is an economic policy in which a country seeks to protect its domestic industries from foreign competition. Governments do this by restricting imports using tools such as tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods, quotas, which limit the quantity of goods that can be imported, and non-tariff barriers such as strict regulations, subsidies for domestic producers, or complex licensing requirements. The stated goal of protectionism is usually to safeguard local industries, preserve jobs, reduce trade deficits, or protect national security interests. These arguments often resonate strongly with voters. However, protectionism has serious disadvantages. Critics argue that it reduces consumer choice, increases prices, discourages innovation, and allows inefficient domestic industries to survive without improving. Additionally, protectionist policies often provoke retaliation from other countries, damaging export sectors and worsening international relations. When protectionist measures escalate and countries respond with retaliatory actions, the situation can develop into a trade war. A trade war occurs when countries impose increasingly severe tariffs or trade barriers against each other. A well-known recent example is the trade conflict between the United States and China, which involved reciprocal tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. Trade wars disrupt global supply chains, raise costs for businesses and consumers, create uncertainty for investors, and slow economic growth. In most cases, they harm all parties involved, and they often require prolonged and difficult diplomatic negotiations to resolve. Next, we turn to vocabulary that describes a country's overall economic health, beginning with economic recession. An economic recession is commonly defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in gross domestic product, GDP. More broadly, it refers to a significant and sustained decline in economic activity across the economy. Recessions are characterized by reduced trade, falling industrial production, rising unemployment, and a general contraction of economic output. In simple terms, the economy slows down. Recent history provides clear examples. The 2008 global financial crisis triggered a severe worldwide recession, resulting in massive job losses, housing market collapses, and widespread financial instability. Governments responded using fiscal policies, such as increased public spending and tax cuts, and monetary policies, such as lowering interest rates, to stimulate demand and prevent the downturn from turning into a prolonged economic depression. Economists closely monitor indicators like employment rates and consumer spending to predict and manage future recessions. Another crucial economic concept that affects everyday life is inflation. Inflation is the sustained increase in the overall price level of goods and services within an economy over time. As prices rise, the purchasing power of money falls, meaning each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. High inflation can have serious consequences. It reduces the value of savings, lowers real wages if salaries do not rise at the same pace, and creates uncertainty for businesses and households trying to plan for the future. When inflation is rapid or unpredictable, it can lead to widespread public dissatisfaction and economic instability. Governments and central banks therefore attempt to control inflation through monetary policy tools, such as adjusting interest rates, aiming to strike a balance between economic growth and price stability. Not all inflation is the same, and economists make important distinctions between different types of inflation. Inflation is not a single, uniform process. One common type is demand-pull inflation, which happens when demand for goods and services is higher than what the economy can produce. This situation is often described as too much money chasing too few goods. When consumers and businesses spend more than the economy can supply, prices naturally rise. Another type is cost-push inflation, which is caused by rising production costs. This can happen when the price of key inputs such as oil, energy, raw materials, or wages increases. Businesses then raise prices to maintain profits, even if demand has not increased. Both types of inflation affect consumers, but they require different policy responses. Central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States or the European Central Bank in Europe, are mainly responsible for controlling inflation and maintaining price stability. Their most important tool is monetary policy, especially adjusting interest rates. By raising interest rates, central banks can slow borrowing and spending, helping to cool inflation. By lowering interest rates, they can encourage investment and consumption when the economy is weak. The ultimate goal is economic stability, avoiding both high inflation and deflation, which is a general fall in prices. Central banks are particularly focused on preventing hyperinflation, an extreme and uncontrollable rise in prices that can destroy an economy, as seen historically in places like Weimar Germany and more recently in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. The final key economic term is unemployment, which may seem simple but has important complexities. Unemployment is officially defined as the condition of being without a job while actively seeking work and being available to start working. Simply not having a job is not enough to be counted as unemployed. A person must be actively looking for employment. Understanding the different types of unemployment is essential for designing effective government policies. One major concern in many countries is youth unemployment, which represents a serious loss of human potential. High youth unemployment can lead to long-term economic damage, social unrest, and lower future productivity. Another type is structural unemployment, which occurs when workers' skills do not match the skills employers need. This often happens due to technological change or shifts in the economy, such as the decline of manufacturing or the rise of automation. Structural unemployment requires long-term solutions like retraining programs, education reform, apprenticeships, and vocational training. There is also cyclical unemployment, which rises during economic recessions and falls during periods of growth. This type of unemployment is closely linked to the overall business cycle. Seasonal unemployment affects industries such as tourism, agriculture, and construction, where work naturally fluctuates throughout the year. Finally, frictional unemployment refers to short-term unemployment that occurs when people are between jobs or entering the workforce for the first time. Because of these distinctions, the headline unemployment rate alone does not tell the full story. Policymakers must analyze the underlying causes of unemployment in order to apply the correct solutions, whether that involves economic stimulus, job training, education reform, or improved job matching services. Together, this final set of economic terms allows learners to describe global trade, financial systems, and labor markets with genuine C1 level precision. These concepts help explain how economies grow, struggle, and recover, and how those processes affect people's everyday lives. To conclude, this has been an extensive and wide-ranging exploration of advanced global vocabulary. We began with the large-scale environmental challenges facing the planet, including climate change, global warming, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. We then moved into deeply human issues such as poverty, inequality, food insecurity, and refugee crises, focusing on justice and well-being. After that, we examined political systems, power structures, and conflict, covering democracy and authoritarianism, corruption, xenophobia, racism, genocide, terrorism, cybersecurity, and nuclear threats. Together, these terms form a powerful language toolkit for understanding and discussing the most serious challenges facing the modern world. Finally, we brought everything together by focusing on the realities of economic life. We looked at key concepts such as globalization, protectionism, economic recession, inflation, and unemployment. These ideas form the economic engine that drives many of the environmental, social, and political issues discussed throughout this exploration. By understanding these terms, you now have a strong and advanced vocabulary that allows you to analyze global issues in a deeper and more meaningful way. This vocabulary gives you the tools needed to think critically across multiple areas at once: the environment, society, politics, and the economy. You are no longer limited to simply describing problems on the surface. Instead, you can explain how these issues are connected, how one problem often worsens another, and why solutions must be carefully designed. You are now able to discuss political consequences, evaluate policy choices, and express complex ideas with much greater confidence and precision. As we conclude, here is a final thought for you to reflect on. Throughout this discussion, we have clearly seen how closely connected all these global challenges are. For example, corruption often deepens inequality by preventing fair access to resources. Environmental crises like climate change directly worsen food insecurity and force people to migrate in search of safety and survival. None of these problems exist in isolation. So the question is this: out of the four major areas we explored, the planet, the people, the systems, and the economy, which one do you believe should be addressed first? Which area, if improved through focused and effective action, could create the strongest positive ripple effects across the others? Is there one key area that could act as a starting point for wider global progress? This is a deep and challenging question, and there is probably no single correct answer. However, thinking about it using the advanced vocabulary you have learned will help you better understand the complexity of the world we live in. Continue using these C1 level terms to explore possible answers, form arguments, and connect ideas across different fields. Thank you for joining us on this extensive and detailed journey through global issues vocabulary at the Fluent English Journey. We hope this deep dive has been useful and has supported your progress towards C1 level English. If you found this exploration helpful, please consider liking the video, sharing it with others who may benefit, and subscribing to the channel for more in-depth learning content. Your support truly helps us continue creating high-quality educational material. We look forward to seeing you again next time.